So yes, big thank you to the Academy Department and to my boss and my colleagues who have listened to this and helped me out. And today I hope you enjoy the lecture that I'm talking about, which links maps and national identity. I'm a South African Belgian artist in London and an RCA graduate and an AV technician at the museum. This is me in my studio in Vauxhall. My practice is researching aspects of national identity and finding ways to produce artwork that explores this. And the object I found most effective in constructing national identities is the map. Maps are provocative because they categorize citizenship while simultaneously tracing the history of occupation. Occupying from the top down in the form of invasions and colonization, and occupying from the bottom up in the form of immigration. I found I occupied both of these legacies, so it was quite unique for me. How do you create national identity? You start with locating yourself within the world to which you are born. This map is from the Gallery 10C downstairs. It's a reproduction printed on animal skin in Germany around 1300. And here we have Jerusalem at the heart of this world, with the makers of the map, Europe, off to one side. This artwork is a collection of histories and not meant to be read as an actual map. However, it is an object of conscription, not only defining your place within the society, but instilling a faith that you needed to believe in. And therefore decentering Europe was purposeful. The direction came from the religious patrons, not only educating the medieval society on how to view their place in this world, but designing a type of history that best reinforced their propagated identity. The consumption of these items may have been by a people who travelled very little, and so their ideas of the world was reinforced by this version of reality. A reality that God was found at the centre of their world, and that culture would be directed by those holy rulers. It reminded me of the theorist Ernest Becker's book, The Denial of Death. He writes about humanity's fear of death, of making one's entire life achievements seem pointless when we encounter our own demise. And so to seek immortality would justify one's living actions, and thus humanity invests in belief, religious belief in life after death, legacy belief in that your children would take you beyond your death, or patriotic belief in the willingness to die for your country so that your country may exist beyond you. And when you decenter yourself from your world, there's an action of acknowledging something larger than yourself. When maps become secular, it seems that Jerusalem is no longer at the center of the world, but the fervor and the structure of what becomes national patriotism remains. And once you're infected, you feel your compulsion to share your enlightenment with the rest of the world. Which brings us to this map. It's in a book called Theatre of the World. It's called The World Map. And it's by Abraham Ortelius in 1570. It's downstairs in Gallery 63. The change shows us how the world is becoming trade and resource-centered to maintain positions of power. The difficulty of fighting within Europe with the complicated royal relations, finite territory, equally matched firepower made seeking resources further afield more appealing. Colonialism provided plenty of benefits in the form of seemingly infinite resources, slave labor, and territorial dominance in the form of the cannon or gun. As the age of the budding empires mapped new lands, they began building a mythology of who has legal right to which occupied territory. The invading culture can create false legacies in the form of subjective histories, and this can be traced in the production of maps. We do love maps. The more detailed, the more the ownership starts to slip into the hands of the cartographer and their investors. You don't have to travel far to see how these historic signs of colonialism echo in our present-day politics. False legacies have a habit of denting the integrity of history. According to Professor Timothy Snyder's Yale lecture series, he remarks on when Catherine the Great sent a delegation of scientists to survey and map the Ukraine. Renaming towns becomes part of fabricating a new history, falsely linking the Ukraine to classic Greek-Roman civilizations. Kadyabe? Okay, I'm not very good at pronouncing these things. Kadyabe becomes Odessa, Kalmiska, Sloboda becomes Mariupol, and thus creating a larger legacy tying Russian rule in with Ukraine and Europe's classic origins. Another map-making example is the Qing dynasty, mapping Tibet as part of their own empire. According to Princeton's Geographic Information System and map librarian, very long title, Tsiering Wang-Yoshawa, the Qing dynasty learned early from Westerners how to take ownership through defining their territories on maps, With the assistance of the French Jesuit, they commissioned the first scientific map of Tibet in 1707 as part of mapping all of China and its claimed territories. Land surveys have a history of taking over and occupying other countries. If a delegation of scientists offer to map your territory for free, just say no. Empires who choose not to acknowledge the legacy of colonization perpetuated the myth that these territories belonged to them, and with nationalism not having any clearly defining categories, national identity could be commandeered with rhetoric. A special relationship, a commonwealth, a common people, and in the case of Ukraine, still part of Russia. The independence of these countries are always at risk, balanced on the controversial and convoluted histories with other nations that have previously dominated them. The late 80s and 90s brought about a transformative time for these nations following the fall of the Soviet Union. When the Ukraine found independence in 1991, apartheid was ending in South Africa in the 1990s. And this is the foundation of my own diabolical composition of national identity. The greatest of all identity crises is the white South African. How am I to create cultural objects when my own sense of national identity is complicit in forms of occupation and fabricated histories? Like the Slovenians of my age, the history we were brought up on no longer exists. The countries we lived in no longer exists. And this is not necessarily a bad thing, but it can become difficult to navigate when you are a cultural practitioner, who are, by their very nature, people who consider culture and identity to be a form of historic truth. Therefore, my practice has been centered on researching the national identity and its effects on society precisely because of my legacy and my origins. It would only seem right that I start at my own beginnings. This is the identity I got when I was born in Cape Town as a white person. The identity of white privilege in South Africa post-apartheid deserved investigation, to take ownership of the benefits that came with that type of citizenship, and to help put in place corrective measures when democracy came in. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission was an important part of that process. I remember watching Archbishop Desmond Tutu hold public hearings to investigate cases of human rights violations on TV. During those long and numerous hearings, people who had suffered would be recognized and they would have their chance for closure by confronting the perpetrators. Controversially, the TRC granted amnesty to any perpetrator who confessed their crimes truthfully. Instead, the apartheid government was condemned as the main perpetrator. The national structure had created a culture of fear and violence that shaped the identities within it, and this painful and open recognition initiated a kind of self-reflection of what kind of state South Africa wanted to be, which became enshrined in their constitution. But what of the ex-empire and their decolonization efforts? In Europe, I felt there was a rush into decolonization without the long process of acknowledging what colonization meant for the ex-colonies. I understood the need to speed up reparations to restore the faith. However, the lack of recognition had annoyed me. And where was South Africa in all this? Being so far from the center of the world, South Africa was an afterthought, but we had been watching Europe and most notably Britain. In Robert Lacour-Gayet's A History of South Africa, he describes the British colonial forces in Cape Colonies as, and I paraphrase here, men who considered their duty of being burdened by civilizing and administrating other nations, with the administration often complaining about the costs of running the colony. An imperial myth. Building infrastructure is part of developing nation states, yes, but what is the purpose of building cable cars, roads, drilling, digging, shipping? It was for export, and resources were sought to maintain an accustomed standard of living in the heart of the empire, a standard of living that would steadily improve so that the impoverished in Britain were beyond comparison to those impoverished in the colonies. And yet, we were all part of this commonwealth. But our common memories were very different. Over 2 decades, I've become acquainted with British common memory of South Africans, especially when SA's democracy was new and I had just arrived in 1998. I often was corrected about my past by Londoners whose memories had been furnished by the BBC, and this had been reaffirmed by someone who they'd once met or an anecdote, and these were transitory experiences and glimpses that re-established this common memory. And Britain was not alone in this. In Paul Doolan's book, Collective Memory in the Dutch East Indies, he comments on how the Dutch he spoke of were progressive and enlightened thinkers, especially towards the rights and liberations of certain countries in the global south. However, when pushed on Indonesia, their ex-colony, they had vague recollections, except they were aware they did terrible things there. And back in Britain, apartheid echoed powerfully through the public memory, but British colonization was vague. In order to undo some of this narrative of social memory, I'll add my own personal history to what I remember happening. When I arrived, I was confronted with my own stereotype for the first time. I was often sung the lines, "I've never met a nice South African," from Splitting Image, which incidentally is quite funny, but you can only be sung it so many times until it starts becoming offensive. I was a social pariah at parties when they found out where I'd come from. My lecturer had informed me that he'd fought against apartheid in the protests in Trafalgar Square and looked at me waiting for me to say something. I didn't quite know what to say. Thank you for your service. Britain had an image of championing itself in the anti-apartheid movement, but it was never publicised where a system like apartheid may have developed, nor that those privileges were so heavily embedded in British society. And it was my political awakening. Every national incident that happened during the 90s became the foundation of my education. And this filled the gap where my school's history had failed. I knew very little history outside because of the heavy government censorship. Our history teacher had stopped teaching us. He made us do independent research projects, perhaps realizing his whole career was about to change dramatically. F. W. de Klerk, the previous president, still hung at the head of the classroom despite Mandela winning the election. I was fortunate to go to the National School of the Arts, which was uncommonly mixed for South Africa at that time. Kids from extravagantly rich parents were seated next to kids from townships. I experienced the exuberance and all the noise and art and songs and dancing that comes when you bring so many different cultures and teenagers together in the same place. However, that does not change who I am. My learned experience is from the position of being a white person, and no amount of mixing will teach me what it feels like to be non-white, especially during apartheid. I had the privilege of a happy childhood and a close family, and I'd benefited from how apartheid had given me a life very different to some of my schoolmates. And therefore, my focus in my practice is always on the history of settlers, colonizers, and the consequences of how power uses forms of nationalism to manipulate our sense of identity. I started at looking at these two maps. I wanted to learn how Europe saw South Africa, and the longer I looked, the more I realized where the intentions lay. This is the first map of Southern Africa, and it shows us the coastal refueling stops for the Portuguese as they document the shore, but they don't go further inland. And Africa appears as a no man's land, a void. The second map begins to take on rivers, and the Europeans begin to go inland. It's evidence that Europe has started using another resource in the form of people and the slave trade. It's not only the beginning of European exploitation, but the legacy of segregation built on the false premise of preserving different cultures. Here's something fun. Which brings me to a video I filmed in 2002. A digital roadmap. I took a road trip with my father from Johannesburg to Cape Town, and he'd worked for the mines. So we were traveling just south of Namakwa. We were traveling through Namakwa and just south of Namibia. I titled it "Obliterated" from Jean Baudrillard's quote, "Driving is a spectacular form of amnesia. Everything is to be discovered. Everything is to be obliterated." And the words describe the repeat revisions of South Africa as it obliterated what came before it and remade culture, history, and national identity time and time again. And brown terse signs displayed the battlefield route. It's a perspective of the apartheid government following the Great Trek and the Anglo-Boer War. School history in apartheid South African textbooks was isolated to the perspective of the Dutch settlers. The Great Trek map was taught to us twice at school because of the lack of history. Later in the film, we travel through a town where the election posters were to elect Mbeki. Let's see if I can get there. Hey, there we go. Maybe there. There we go. So you see the posters on there. As president, as the freedom fighters were then electable to government positions, and the ANC becomes a mainstay thereafter. And now, in 2025, I'm watching the video in the time the Born Free generation has decided not to vote for the ANC. So there's this change of three different histories present in one film. And throughout the filming, you see the road, a well-maintained road for miles, and you can see roadworks with hardly any people to use them except for delivery trucks. And I realize roads are important for export. The real power in South Africa has not really shifted. The mines had control of these areas, and these lands have been shaped to fulfill the needs of an empire. And if land gives you your sense of identity, what does that mean for the people who live in a place that is built to support others elsewhere? South Africa was not made in isolation. It came out of 5 centuries of European rule, and it was the experiment the Europeans had hoped to forget. Most of you probably know about the South African Native Land Act of 1913. It becomes a precursor for apartheid. The writing up of this act was to annex land for mining and farming, and it was drafted by British businessman and founder of De Beers mine, Cecil Rhodes, who incidentally mined the area that we were driving through in the previous video. And if white people are the ones drawing up the maps, they will be the bias. Non-white families found themselves on land that had now had new owners, and they had become the tenants. And once you're a tenant, you have to make rent, something that we know too well in London. The process reworks itself in other countries because it comes from other countries. London has a leasehold where we never own the land, and yet it costs the same price to buy it. And so non-white families were converted into cheap labor. Land was not claimed once in South Africa, but it becomes a habit to maintain economic and social control during apartheid. As with Sophiatown in Johannesburg, whenever a location becomes a cultural success, mixing people and music, it was steamrolled out of existence. Street culture decentralized and the propagated national identity and threatened the strict structure of citizenship. In 2018, I started to read about the land reclamation debates in South Africa, with the political discussions revolving about how to give the land back. The painting I made was this commemorative textile similar to the Mandela one, but I started turning it into a mural because I was thinking of war, because this was all about the destruction of buildings. And I added the personalities who were the most vocal and the culturally iconic images. The traditional cultural dress on the one side, that side, on the right side, and those standardized uniforms of maids and petrol pump attendants of creating a workforce. The continuous hanging of washing of the domestic workers and the never-ending labor and the bulldozer. I incorporated the organic shape of a township of an informal settlement, that round bit in the middle, as the white suburbs were always built in grid form. Bias becomes greater when the comparisons are controlled over who can exist where, simply because what's in your view. Your neighborhood would lock you into your sense of reality. For example, how many white South Africans had to work as petrol pump attendants? Racial segregation was financial segregation initiated under the guise to preserve different cultures. And in this case, I'm always wary of the cultural argument to manipulate national identity. And once again, reform becomes tricky because of this detail. Lekota and Groenewald were contemporary politicians voicing on the opposing side of the debate, with the exception of Plaatje being the original objector to the Native Land Act. In 1914, he travelled to Britain to petition the government to reverse the act, but was denied, perhaps because Rhodes was invested in the writing up of that act. Furthermore, the land was bought. It was never given freely, complicating the matters of ownership. And how do you give land back? On one hand, land has been paid for, cultivated by generations of families who had no part in the implementation of the original Native Land Act, nor the apartheid forced removals. This land had become their home. However, they were the benefactors of that law. On the other hand, how do you trace and redistribute land to the families who originally lived there? How many descendants, and which descendants can be considered part of that lineage? Which land should qualify? How much do you get? And paramount to this, what qualifies you to own land? In order to understand inherited privilege as the ideal citizen at the centre, perhaps we should go outside. My mother and I arrived in London in 1998 when I was 16, and we shared a room in Streatham, and then I lived in the lounge for a further 2 years until I could afford my own rent. As soon as I arrived, I got a job at McDonald's where I was paid a healthy £3.75 an hour and earned Employee of the Month where they spelt my name wrong. We were not aware of our rights. We sought advice on what to do with my education because it was customary in South Africa to finish school at 18. However, the social service were reluctant. They recommended that since I don't have my GCSEs for my A-levels and I was too old for my GCSEs, I should just quit and get a job. I was now an immigrant. But my mother didn't accept that, and she forced me on some South London sixth form, desperate for students. It was a Catholic school, and she brought my first Holy Communion to prove that I was indeed a Catholic. It worked. Later, I arrogantly applied for university like all my peers. I believed that I was the same as the other students. When I went to the university interview, the man announced I was entering as a foreign student with the incumbent massive increase of fees. I argued that I had the golden ticket. I have an EU passport thanks to my father. But his response was, I have a South African accent. I was informed by the Home Office that I had no right for financial help as I had not worked in the country for 4 years yet. I'd only worked 3 since arriving at 16. The Home Office eventually returned my physical passport a month too late to convince the interviewer that I was indeed a legitimate EU member, and by then I had given up my place in art school. And I went to work as a temporary receptionist, where I became well acquainted with another map, the London A to Z. I observed London from the receptionist position of the trade union buildings, in the financial buildings, in Postcom, as the government was privatising Royal Mail. What I'd lost in an early start at education, I gained in taking the time to observe and understand my new home. The experience taught me that there are unseen privileges and they're normalised and connected with citizenry. Education can be a privilege. And my family was a contradiction, especially in Europe. Not quite European, not quite African, not quite English. And time didn't stand still. Laws and rights kept on changing. I had to reapply to keep my Belgian passport with a long list of family documents. My application took even longer as my French translator misspelled my second name before leaving the country. I was told I need to get the original translator, and so I had to hunt him down before the deadline. I revised the document, and it was FedExed to me over from Mexico, where he was then. This application was mainly to provide proof that my father was and still is a Belgian, and that he was and still is my father. And then laws changed again in South Africa, where I had to reapply to keep my passport to prove that I had indeed been born there. And I had to apply to the Department of Home Affairs to send my original birth certificate from South Africa to London and then send that application from London back to South Africa Home Affairs, which was like giving my birth certificate a round trip from the UK to SA. Incidentally, when collecting my South African identity book in London, I opened it to find another woman's face on it. I was assured that this was only the second time it happened in 2 days. These processes made me feel vulnerable, that I would lose my identity and any right to exist in any country. It held me suspended between nations and their evolving political relationships towards immigrants. It was not until Brexit happened that I felt it was about time someone spoke about these fictional immigration stories of how wonderfully easy it must be to come over and steal jobs. Oops. I revised this experience in my RCA thesis, retelling the process of maintaining my original citizenry, and I printed it on an inverted geological map of Africa, reinventing the projection, tracing over the acres and acres of mineral wealth on the continent that had found its way to enrich Europe. For me, there was no South African diaspora, as we'd all grown up in pockets of our own different realities. Our national identities were fractured. The most reliable form of national culture would be directly from my lived experience. I read Steve Biko's book, I Write What I Like, taking note of his version of consciousness by way of nurturing identity from one's own mind and not from a group ideology. Unlike the American Black consciousness, which would have been impossible to demonstrate in a regime like apartheid, Biko's approach was internal and individual. From considering who you think you are within the world despite the social rules of division, national ideology, and ties to citizenship that has you bound. And in this case, everyone will have a different personal idea of who they consider themselves to be. It also is a long process that requires pragmatism and accepting mistakes so long as we're prepared to do the work to correct them. Identity is also a collection of legacies left behind, those unconscious messes like the bits of Europe left in Africa. And I read this quote posted on the Daily Maverick newspaper last week while I was writing this. 5 minutes after you're born, they will decide your name, nationality, religion, and caste, and you will spend your life fighting and stupidly defending things you didn't choose. I tried to move back to South Africa in 2011 one evening, and I spoke to a lady, a patron of the dance theatre in Cape Town. She wasn't very keen on the contemporary African productions, and she praised Swan Lake in its purest form. And I thought to myself, Europe has moved on. They perform many other types of Swan Lake, and you're holding on to the Europe that no longer exists. Because if that goes, what's left of you? White South African identities seem to be made up of fading legacies, and the integration into African cultures would be inappropriate and ill-fitting. Ironically, we considered Swan Lake as European in South Africa, but the roots are in Russia, and is Russia Europe? It becomes a wormhole when you start getting into national identities and their relative histories. But it becomes even more absurd when you live in an ex-colony that is built part of its identity on the misunderstandings of elsewhere, simply because we were so far from the center of the world that we believed was our national identity. I turned this thesis into a large painting called South Towards the Dark Continent. In this rendition, Europe becomes a dark continent, flipping the narrative, and yet each of these 30 paintings could be sold separately, and thus the cycle of colonization continues. I embraced failure. Here on screen, you can see that I failed myself on my university assessment. I included in the fail manifesto all the different types of fails that you could do. This was a calculated fail because I knew I couldn't fail doing this, and I didn't. And then also you'd also have the mother of all fuck-ups, which would be classed as an unintentional fail. The failure project was about existing in spaces that aren't made for you. And the creation of rules towards passing or failing meant regulations are meant with a specific ideal citizen in mind. Failure relied on the philosophy that if you're not at the center, your reality has a greater chance of being invalidated. Your place is as the uninvited guest, and as such, you have more chance of making cultural mistakes. I moved on to consider the environment of national identity in stereotypes by addressing the imprint of a common public memory. I attended an artist residency in Fukuoka, Japan, where I was thinking of ways we connect with the world and when we're imprinted with our sense of self by the first culture that we meet. Adversely, how cultural stereotypes are born by the first imprint we have of an immigrant we come into contact with. And so I recreated myself imprinting greasy shadows on the sliding doors of our house, making this giant lantern that you can see on the screen. On residency, I committed myself to a daily morning run. I had previously lived in Hiroshima for a couple of years, and running had become a habit to help calm my mind when I was dealing with culture shock. As an immigrant, you're always seen, and being the object of attention, your behavior is monitored. Prior to my arrival, another artist had gotten naked and ran into the rice paddy fields, and that had offended the farmers. One of the clauses of our artist contract was that we would not run naked into the rice farmers' fields. On the first morning, I found I was being followed by the farmer in his truck. He slowly crept behind me at a distance because I couldn't run very fast. And then the next couple of days, he would watch stationary from inside his truck. He finally stopped the surveillance altogether, and later on, he would be working and I no longer troubled him. Negative impacts could change with conditioning, active involvement, conscious routine, and time, ultimately with a real effort to clean up what was left behind by others. And it's not always directly your fault, but if you benefited from it, it becomes part of your legacy. And you don't have to be socially active. Society monitors each other. Your performance as a citizen is constantly monitored and reviewed, and therefore positive changes to your routine can affect others. Or at least that was my theory. I brought the shoji sliding door paper back, and I was studying in Dundee at the time, and I decided to paint a giant window. This is the proposal and all the different tests that I did. I wanted to concentrate on Britain's departure from Europe and in the physical sense of the geological rupture between the buried Doggerland, which is underwater. And how do we paint a memory of belonging to something that we no longer belong to? So during lockdown, I tested many different painting techniques and tried to present two sides at the same time. And because the paper is transparent, you would see the pigment at different lights, at different values at different lights. So you'd always have two sides present at the same time. And I finally settled on a naval map. This is landing. The painting was hung in a stairwell in that uncomfortable halfway point between going up or down. You don't have time to dwell on your decisions until you finish your journey, much like history, and everything seems clearer in hindsight. Incidentally, the painted map blocked out the reality of the world outside, so it creates this bubble where you can be blind in your own belief of your national heritage because you're unable to step outside. I became more ambitious and painted floating fortresses, which I hung in a gallery in Hiroshima. The painting took 4 weeks to paint, and the artwork considered island empires. For me, there seemed to be some similarities in the notion of exceptionalism and feeling isolated between these two nations of Japan and the UK. Outside becomes a colonial resource, but the immigrants from outside are invaders, and thus the title fortresses. The difficult relationship these islands have with their closest neighbour also seemed to be a connecting theme, so I floated both Britain and Japan in a sea of their own. The predominant pigment is pink because I was thinking of being inside a body. I used Freud's notion of separation anxiety. When we become detached from the world we know, from our mother's womb, we become anxious of our surroundings. And so the mother country acts as a secure womb-like state where we're sure of ourselves and our identity. Inside it is secure and warm and red, and the outside becomes an awe-inspiring and formidable. The nation is part of creating a religion and converting the masses to a new belief system, and in this case, patriotism. Hence, I made a version of a stained glass window. Inspired by reading Rhodes' extensive Native Land Act, which listed every single land and who can have it, I attempted the same with Britain. Britain was for sale in sections, which I cut up indiscriminately as they did in Africa, so we had 12 paintings. The collection of paintings was titled The Territory Formerly Known as Great Britain. I read that in the laws of occupation you can occupy territory, but not countries, and so territory becomes an important word. The painting featured Roger Murchison's geological map during the height of the empire with the shadow of the 2016 referendum vote behind it. The exhibition was accompanied by an infomercial where I used common estate agent sales terminology, giving everyone the right to buy property and own, or at least have the right to invade part of Britain. I created a fictional auction corporation with the tagline, "Nation building since the dawn of invasions." Some of the paintings were sold, so I retitled the artwork What's Left of Britain, looking at the nostalgia of the past against the reality of Britain's post-imperialism, post-colonialism, as the gradual loss of assets from those transformations have caused. This artwork was presented with two other paintings or land deeds. One's called Diamond Mines and the other one's called Asbestos Mines. I used to live on Havelock Asbestos Mine in 1987 to 1989. My father was brought there during the sales negotiation of British Turner and Newell and the South African companies Jeffco and Gencor. It was a white asbestos mine in northern Eswatini, and you can see the white asbestos dump. It's on the Google satellite imagery. It's still there. When I was a little girl, I remember a man telling me that it would get into my lungs and make me very sick. I thought he meant the pampas grass, and from that point onwards, I stayed well away from that plant. It was only when I became an adult that I finally realized he was not pointing at the grass, but at the white asbestos dump behind it. And it became a haunting knowledge as I researched further into my past that the men on the mines had known that miners were being exposed to this and getting sick. The workers who got asbestos poisoning on Havelock were sent to work their retirement on the golf course. And it's this kind of disturbing reality that registers when you think about who works on a mine and who works in a mine. And those prepositions on and in are historic and important. As a form of cultural linguistics to dictate your value of citizenry in a society even as small as a mine. Havelock was closed in 1990, and I've searched and not found any mention of compensation for the Eswatini miners. And by the time my family arrived, it was right at the end of the 67 years of production, and millions of pounds had already found their way into the British economy. The map I used to paint this area was taken from a colonial geological survey that discovered the site of the asbestos, which I turned into a series of 3 paintings. The British had worked with the Swazi king to exploit this resource. Even royalty had been implicated, with the Queen and the mine being present on an old stamp that I found. I performed a reading in a glass box, why not, reciting back the story of Eswatini's independence and the beginning of Havelock Mine, while the box slowly fills with packing peanuts. The piece was called Empire on the Verge of a Nervous Breakdown. Today, Havelock Mine has been converted into an orphanage, ingeniously utilizing the infrastructure of the roads and houses that were left behind when the mine was closed. A good ending. A lot of my research on maps leads me to question the different forms of occupation and their outcome. At what point do we become occupiers or the occupied? And how have we altered the historic narrative to ease our conscience? I still think about those apartheid history textbooks which should exist so that we don't forget. Each country and every occupation has a unique philosophical question, and no two are alike, but we're much more integrated to other nations than we actually think we are. And this is my most recent work, which considers the laws of occupation, taking maps of countries made by the outsiders who want those countries and eventually own them. And this is my final painting. is called the center of the world, which it once was. And it's the area where east meets west on the Silk Route, taken from the USSR geological map of 1967. But today, these stands or lands are no longer the center of the world. And it's a reminder that the center is always temporary. The center provides security and a privilege that inhabits our sense of national identity. But there's something profoundly moving about believing in the land that you come from. And it was so for me when I witnessed the end of apartheid and New South Africa. Strangely enough, also when I saw the image of a man running over London Bridge with a pint during the terrorist attack. National identity is inherited from the lands that we spend our lives in keeping with the theme of our motherland. We are not our parents and can be conscientious in deciding which parts are important to keep and which parts should be revised. And in doing so, we need to critically review our histories that we have been taught and the maps that we've placed ourselves within. Thank you. Thank you for listening today.